to the Action Podcast. Here's your host, my dad.
Well, welcome back to the XM Podcast. We truly are appreciative of all of our listeners. We have a great show for you today, and we're really excited to get into this topic. Over the next 2 episodes, we're going to be talking about kids and teens. We recently, as a country, have faced another tragedy with a mass shooting in Texas. I don't know what to say about it, but it's a horrible act, and it is just so sad. I don't know that we will solve all the problems, but we are certainly going to discuss what is happening in our country. Today, our guest is a colleague of mine from Emerge. She is the lead of our child and adolescent team, and well, she's just a tremendous therapist. Please welcome to the show, right after these messages, our guest, licensed professional counselor, Rachel Kyer. Do you want to be part of a team that is faith-based and clinically focused? If you're a licensed therapist that lives in any of the 50 states and interested in doing telecounseling, or maybe you're located in Northeast Ohio and you are interested in doing telecounseling or even in-person therapy, Emerge Counseling Ministries might be the right team for you. We have been helping people for over 50 years and want you to be part of our next generation of therapists. Go to emerge.org/careers for more information. We offer very competitive pay along with benefits and a signing bonus. Contact us today to start helping people find rest and live free tomorrow. We can't wait to meet you.
So my name is Rachel Kyer. I'm a clinician at Emerge Counseling Ministries, and I just recently accepted the position of team lead for the childhood and adolescent team, which means I get to help our lovely staff that work with kiddos just brainstorm and stay up to date on best practices, how we can best support our teens and adolescents and parents and the problems that are coming through our doors at Emerge.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me a little bit about your journey getting into therapy and mental health. Like, what was the draw there?
Yeah, I think a huge piece of it for me was my own journey, experiencing some really talented individuals and therapists in my own life that helped me through some difficult seasons, that were able to see me, I think, and even in places when maybe I didn't see myself or I didn't see the hope in the future. I was very inspired by that position and just what an honor it is to meet somebody in that space. And so that's something that I really feel the Lord has given me a calling to come into that space. Mm-hmm. And the more that I have, I think, developed in my time as a clinician, I've really come to appreciate specifically how I get to work like with kids and with adults and parents specifically. I think there's such a need for like meeting in that place. It's so hard to raise kids, especially today. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that I think it's been interesting to watch that calling develop for me as I've gained experience and worked with different individuals.
Yeah, I love the fact that you mentioned, because we're going to be talking a lot about adolescents, teens, kids, but also the parent aspect of it. And when, you and I both have worked with that population of young adults, teens, and when you're working with that population, you're also working very closely with whoever the primary caregiver is. And that may be both parents, maybe one parent. Sometimes it's a grandparent, but whoever is, most involved in raising of that child. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about and focusing on today. And maybe if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your passion, what got you into really wanting to care for that age group, and also got Emerge to bring you in as our team lead for our kids and adolescent group.
Yeah, I think a huge piece, even as you mentioned, that parent piece. As a clinician, I don't think that is a small aspect of what it is to work with kids and with teens. I always say in intake sessions that, whatever grown-up brought you into their office, like they are potentially your greatest support system. And I want to help create safe space for that to be safe and helpful for that kiddo outside of my office. because I can be there to be a support person for them for that hour that we're meeting weekly or every other week. But the rest of the time, that's the person that is potentially, in their corner fighting the hardest for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I also believe as Christians, there is, I think, just a specific holiness to the relationship of like the parent child, right? Like God so often in scripture talks about the body of Christ and even how we are a family of believers. And so I think that model of the family is something that has a very strong spiritual aspect to it that I really feel honored, I guess, to step into that space and help, because a lot of times they're very complicated situations or, difficult places that families are trying to walk through. And so helping not only the client walk through those spaces, but empowering the parents to, support and love and guide their child in the best way possible and come out on the other side of that stronger instead of more separated, I think is something that I see as a huge part of what I do.
Yeah. It's so needed. I mean, you and I have been talking about recording this podcast for several weeks. And then just a few days ago, a major national event took place and it's heartbreaking. I mean, every time I think about it, my wife and I were watching the news the other night and we both just looked at each other. We're just bawling at what a just horrendous event took place in Texas. And again, I don't know that we have the answers to all of these things, but as a mental health therapist, and again, this is probably a loaded question, what are some of your thoughts around what is going on in a young man's life, a teenager's life that would possibly get him to a place where he would do something like we just saw in Texas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, definitely, I think in the atrocity that happened in Texas and the many previous school shootings that we have seen in our country, historically, there always seems to be very clear warning signs for the perpetrator getting to that place. Like you're saying, it's a young man, right? He is, as difficult as it may be to look at that person with compassion and try to seek to understand where they're coming from. I think that is so needed because that to me says, well, if we can see that brokenness and we can meet that person in their brokenness, maybe we can prevent that from happening. And, of course, there are so many different pieces that go into prevention of something like this in the future. But I think the amount of pain that individual had, and I'm guessing probably not the people in his corner that were able to guide him and to love him as he needed. But yeah, I mean, obviously it's such a complicated situation and it's easy to try to make sense of it. But also, we get little snippets from the news, but ultimately I think there is a piece that is just beyond our understanding, just the amount of pain and the amount of brokenness.
Absolutely. And I'm not asking that question for us to over pathologize things that we don't know and trying to fit in, ideas or thoughts that into question marks that we have about this situation. But I want to spend our time kind of talking, the two of us, around what do we do as parents? Like from a clinical perspective, what things are you noticing in your ministry and your practice that parents need to know? Like, because it's tough. I mean, raising kids, I think, has always been challenging. And you and I kind of talked maybe a week ago in our pre-interview, but we're also dealing with some other stressors in our current culture that maybe have not been as prevalent as they are now. And I think there are different stressors, and life is a little bit different than maybe it was 30, 40 years ago. So talk to me a little bit about maybe some of the conversations you have with parents who are concerned about their kids, young adults, teens.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the biggest questions that I notice and even concerns from parents showing up in my office is often questions of identity. I think for later elementary age, all the way through teens, like there is often such a question of whether a child is struggling with their sexuality or what group they feel like they fit in with, or how they present themselves in the world. There's a lot of distress there. And I think, like what you're saying, the world around us is changing so quickly. Even the world that I grew up in, not that that was that long ago, but it's drastically different. And then, factor into that another 10, 15, 20 years of parents being a little bit further. Things have changed really drastically. And I definitely think there is always a question for me as a clinician, but also for parents, the line between what is developmentally normal, like what's the developmentally normal amount to struggle with identity or to struggle with becoming your own person, or, even just teen angst kind of stuff, versus when is it clinically significant? When do we need to do something different because this is a bigger issue?
Yeah. I think that's a huge point. I'd love for you to expand a little bit on the idea of what is normal. And when I say normal, I'm putting up air quotes, issues that teens are going through. And then when do we know that they start to get clinical? Like when is that a line of delineation that we need to be aware of?
And I think this is a question that is not always quite easy to answer. I'm sure a lot of parents would agree with that. Mm-hmm. I think I see both ends of the spectrum. Parents that are maybe I don't want to say over concerned, but maybe hyper aware of the amount of struggle their child is going through, mm-hmm. And bring them in to make sure that everything's fine. And sometimes as a counselor, I get to step in and say, hey, no, this is actually like pretty normal. Let's get some coping skills, but this is pretty normal. But then I think the opposite end, I also see a lot of clients coming in and they feel as if they have been struggling for quite a while and have been asking for help, and their parents maybe don't see or don't understand quite the level to which they are. And the parents might see it more as a normal developmental thing. And then by the time the child gets into my office, they might have been in their clinically significant struggle with depression or anxiety for a couple of years. So I think it is a difficult line. And I think that's something that even as a clinician, sometimes I have to take a step back and ask myself as well, because there is so much. Obviously, developmentally, children and teens are going to be a little bit more, their view of the world is coming from, it's me focused. And so there's the stereotype of kids and teens being the world revolves around them, right? And that holds some truth. So there is that level where things that are a big deal to our like adolescents, maybe in the grand scheme of things, aren't that big of a deal. Yeah. But I guess one of my thoughts specifically is the power that a parent has in being able to hear their child and take their child's input and try to come alongside and validate and support that. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, I think our children, though, working to develop their own discernment, working to make sense of the world, they're not always going to be 100% accurate, but a lot of times they are aware. They know when it's normal and when it's not. Yeah. And I think a lot of times we miss that because as adults, we feel that we are responsible to have the answers, that we need to know what's best. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the biggest thing that I see showing up in my office is the client saying, I've been asking for this. I've been saying this is not okay. And my parents haven't been hearing me. Yeah. And having that willingness to even just be open and hear your child, where they're coming from. And maybe it's going to be a little bit of a give and take, right? Like maybe the child isn't totally accurate in it, but being willing to hear that, I think can potentially help us in our discernment as adults and as parents trying to love on that kiddo.
Yeah. I share this with parents all the time. I was like, usually, and I'm kind of giving a rough age range, but usually around 10, 11, 12, the identity of the child usually comes through whoever the primary caregiver is. And right around 10, 11, 12, it starts to switch into their social circle. And that's where the parents start to feel the first like uncleaving of their child, and they start to freak out a little bit because now all of a sudden the most important thing in the world is not the parent's approval as much as it is I need my peer approval. And when Timmy doesn't sit next to me at lunch, that is a massive thing. And so I'm understating, especially when, a lot of my clients who are struggling, it's because they're not connecting with their friends, and social media is bullying them, and all of these other things are happening. And I think a lot of times as parents, we don't take it as seriously as maybe as our kid is feeling about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And I love that comparison that you even offered of like prior to, that shift at age 10, 11, 12, a child is going to be looking to their primary caregiver for that love and that acceptance. And then during those preteen, puberty age, that's going to switch to their peers. And so even if we just use that as a loose comparison, think about the impact that we might assume a child would feel if their parent neglected them, or their parent made fun of them, or their parent told them they weren't good enough. We would see that and be like, wow, that's awful. I can imagine the amount of pain, the deep impact that's going to have in your life and your development. And I think this is even like, it's helping me, I think, to understand this a little bit as we're talking, because viewing that and kind of saying like, okay, yeah, when you're looking for your validation in your peers, or even just making sense of who you are and your identity, those are really deep wounds. They're not just surface level things that you're going to grow out of.
Yeah. And you alluded to it earlier. It comes down to acceptance. We all want to be accepted. And when we find groups or cliques that don't accept us, then we will move to another one that will. And oftentimes, wherever we start, and if we don't find acceptance there, we'll start going down the list. And eventually, I think a lot of times kids that I've noticed, they end up in groups that accept them, but these groups are horrible influences. And then you start to see these other problems. And, I think that's one of the kind of lifelong desires of the human experience is I want to be accepted. And I think, I always call like junior high and high school, it's like such a crazy microcosm of one of the craziest pressure cookers of all time. We're going to take a bunch of kids and we're going to put them in the most rapidly changing era of their life. We're going to put them under one roof and then see what happens. And it's like, it's an unbelievable science experiment. And I feel for kids, because it is so difficult, especially if there's something about you that's a little bit different or unique, or, because at those ages, unfortunately, those unique attributes are not celebrated. They're ostracized. And I think that's a massive issue with that age group.
Yeah. And I think one of the things you hit on with that seeking identity and going from group to group, I think that's one of the things that sometimes is alarming to parents, to see their child, and not so much going from group to group, but I think watching their child go through significant changes of their interests or their style or their friends. And that's something that is very developmentally normal. It's not unusual for a child at that age they're wrestling with their identity and who they are and how they fit in, and where they're going to be accepted. And so I think that's something that oftentimes I see parents show up in my office and they're so very concerned because, their child used to act this way, or their child used to dress this way, or was interested in these things. And now all of a sudden there's someone totally different. And that's terrifying. Or maybe even their child is kind of trying out a couple different identities. And that can be really, really scary, but it's not always a bad thing. That's not always a red flag. Sometimes that's just part of development.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to give my parents credit. I know I was probably about 14, 15, and I got really into music, and I started wearing eyeliner, and my hair was all kinds of purple, blue. And I looked like I probably walked out of a, grunge band, but they allowed me to be, and I appreciate, and I've told them that in adulthood that, thank you for allowing me to go through that process. Cause I know my dad was probably freaking out, it's like, what happened to my son?
Punk rock child.
Oh, for sure. I remember we were playing the show and we were traveling, and, I was probably 16, and we were at a Taco Bell, and I got out of, we were in a big old van, and I got out, and there was a woman who pulled up in the to go line or whatever, and she just looked at me, and her windows were down, and she goes, "Holy Jesus." And I know I got out of the car, and
herself.
But I walked by the car and I said, "No, ma'am, I'm not him, but go and sin no more." And I just kept walking. It's just like,
I'm so impressed you had the wherewithal to say that to her. I would have thought about that later.
Yeah. But it was fun. And I just knew, but that was part of, I was trying to find my identity, and part of it was shock value. And, it's almost like going to an extreme so you can kind of come back to whatever normality is. And so, Rachel, what are some of your thoughts around what do parents do? Like, I think there are so many things that I'm a parent, and it's like there are so many things in the world that we're concerned about, that we're stressed about. But at the same time, I've got to have faith that God's in control. But at the same time as well, I have to do my due diligence as a parent. So what are some of your thoughts? And maybe if you can take a moment to just address the parents in our audience. Yeah.
I mean, first off, for the parents in the audience, I just want to encourage you, because I know that it is not an easy job. And that is one of the biggest things that I try to do with parents that come into my office, because I know that no matter the amount of struggle, I believe that parents are doing the best they have with what they can. And one thing that I would say that I have heard feedback from clients specifically is not feeling understood by parents. And that is the biggest thing that I think causes emotional distance, causes, dysfunction or conflict, causes even pain, I think, within the child. Even going back to that being understood and accepted, yes, by our peers, but also I think there's still a part of us in those teen years, although we kind of are trying to distance ourselves from our parents, we also want to be known and accepted by our parents. And so I always encourage parents to try to meet their child where they're at. And I know sometimes that's going to be like, maybe you're not going to get their interest, right? Maybe you're going to think it's totally crazy, but like, how can you meet them in that space and seek to understand them? I think being willing to have dialogue about where your child is, and trying to work with your child to even make sense of right or wrong or rules or things like that. And I know that's maybe a controversial thing to say, because as parents, we want to have the answer and set it down and hold really strict to that. But I think a lot of times we want to raise our children to be competent adults that can make wise decisions. And so I think part of that is like, well, then what does it look like to have training wheels on our child to make wise decisions for themselves, to have boundaries for themselves, to even decide what appropriate consequences are? Like, is that something that we can begin to invite our child into as they, as they show that they are able and they are willing to? I think that is something that a lot of times parents are very afraid of, but that can be hugely beneficial to even just open up that conversation to your child, instead of being an all-knowing parent who makes the rules and is, this is how things are, but more like, well, let's try to have a conversation. And of course, that it works is easier in some situations than it is in others. Yeah. I mean, that's not always going to be the case, but I think that's a huge place to start.
Yeah. One thing I've an exercise that I've worked with families, and it was something that was instilled in me as a child. So my parents, and I'm the oldest, and then my younger brother, Friday nights growing up, we would always have a family time. And I know my brother and I at one point were just like, oh, we don't want to do this. But I look back, and what we would do is we had a back deck, and we would go out on the back deck, and we had a little gazebo. We would go sit in the gazebo, and we knew there was no distractions there. And I can't remember, it was like a stuffed animal. And whoever was holding the stuffed animal had the floor. And they could say whatever it was. And it wasn't, no matter what it wasn't wrong, but there would be a discussion about it. But you had the time to get off your chest whatever you needed. And I've done that with families, and saying, sometimes we want to constantly be correcting our kids rather than just hearing them and let them speak. And that was an opportunity for my brother and I, because I remember growing up, I felt like he would instigate, I would respond, I would get in trouble. And that was an opportunity for me to be able to share my truth and hear that. And then we would be able to kind of work it out in dialogue. And it didn't always work out to my favor, but sometimes it was like, at least I was being heard. And I think that's a really important thing. And then the other thing I wanted to make mention of what you were talking about, I think one of the most powerful things parents can do is admit when they're wrong. And I think a lot of times parents get fearful that if they say they're wrong, they give their power pellet away. And it's like, I have to know everything. And what I have found with young adults and teens and adolescents is that when they find that you're a human being and that you can own your own stuff, that is a bigger teaching moment than sometimes you actually teaching them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. And I think, kids learn by example, right? Like we say that we're like, well, the people you surround yourself with, that's who you're going to turn out like. So the same thing is true for us as parents. If we are modeling humility, if we are modeling the ability to address conflict in a healthy way, even when it means that it's a little uncomfortable for us, then our kids are going to pick up on that. Yeah. I think one of the things that you mentioned was the correcting, that need to maybe get stuck in the always correcting our child. An approach that I really love, especially working with kids, is TBRI. It's trust-based relational intervention. And one of the core things about that is that they put connecting principles and correcting principles, and they're very much tied together. And so their thought is that in order to parent, you have to have a good relationship. In order to bring correcting alongside, you have to have the relational piece. You have to be connected. You have to have both of those things, because I think we could probably all imagine someone in our life that maybe had a very connected relationship, but there weren't a lot of rules or corrections around them, and that didn't turn out super great. And on the other end, you have a parent that's very confident in correcting and constantly correcting their child, but there's not a deep connection. Neither one of those really ends up in a good place for, I think, parent or child.
Yeah, that's really good. Rachel, what are some other things? Is there anything else you feel like you would like to share? And knowing that our listeners, there might be kids listening. I know there's parents listening. Just any other thoughts you may have that you want to leave with them?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that I would like to communicate is just that line of, when is it good to get your child help? Yeah. I will reiterate what I said earlier in this podcast of asking your child and listening to them. So if your child is asking for help, sometimes that's enough. Even if you don't fully see it, even if you don't fully understand, that's an opportunity for you to say to your child, okay, I believe you, I hear you, I want to come alongside and help you. And then maybe that's a role where, like, us as professionals, we get the opportunity to see and assess. And, maybe a couple sessions later, we realize things are actually okay, but that child still has that experience of being affirmed by their parent. Yeah. Another thing that I think is a huge line is if your child is self-harming, if there's anything, either suicidal conversation, notes, anything like that, even joking sometimes, I've noticed that is something that people let slide, which for me, we need to talk about that. We need to figure out what's going on there. But anytime that there is physical harm happening, that's a really important line to get your child in to see somebody so that we can address what else is going on.
That's good. Yeah, I think that's super important. And I think, let me ask you this, and this just kind of popped in my head because I feel like I have this conversation all the time. What do you think it is? How do you think the appropriate approach for parents to have access to their kids' devices? Like, what are your thoughts around that? What are some of the appropriate boundaries? Because I honestly believe that you can do it in a healthy, proper way, but I think parents need to know what's going on. Because I share this with every one of my clients who are kids. The internet in their mind is a portal out to the world. but in reality, it's a portal into that kid's room, or the world can get into that kid's life. And I think that kids think about it as them just connecting externally, but you're opening up a corridor for the world to get in. And that's where a lot of the issues that I have seen with clients is really there's no boundaries with their devices. And a lot of these kids that I've worked with, I mean, they're up on their phones till 2 a.m, knowing they have to be at school at 6. And what are your thoughts? Like sharing to a parent who's listening, going, what is appropriate and how do we navigate that issue?
Yeah, so I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all answer to this, because I think children's, their needs are going to be different. So this is going to require discernment on the part of the parent. But as with many things, access to a device, access to the internet is a tool that the child has, that we can either as adults teach them how to use that as something that is healthy and something that is good and helpful, or we can allow them to use that in a way that is detrimental. And so I really think starting intentionally with when you're exposing your child to a device and how much time they're spending on it. And then as you would any other responsibility, I think having conversations and setting boundaries that are age appropriate and that you think maybe follow where your child is able to set boundaries for themselves, right? I think a lot of the difficulty comes with like what you were saying, where a lot of times teens and kids don't realize maybe the gravity that a device has, or the potential even danger.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest things with rules, especially surrounding devices, is I always encourage parents to be consistent. I mean, this is rules across the board, but be consistent. This is a set, what the expectation is, and I am going to follow through with that. I think the biggest conflict that I see coming is when there is inconsistency on the parent's part, or when the child is, totally blindsided and feels this is unfair because I don't know what to expect, or I'm not in on the conversation, right? Like, I don't understand why you're doing this. And so both of those things I think need to be present, like having an open conversation, but then also setting appropriate boundaries and then holding those boundaries for your child.
Yeah. I mean, my wife and I, we noticed it with our 4-year-old, and we were allowing her a very limited amount of time with an iPad so she could watch. She loves Barbie and she likes kids' YouTube. And we started monitoring it. And even though it was kids' YouTube, there was some stuff that was getting in there that was completely inappropriate for a 4-year-old. And we made her aware of the boundaries of that. And we, we're trying to filter out all this stuff. It's amazing to me how they can still get, certain products in front of a 4-year-old's eyes. And there was one day my wife was, I was at work and she had called me. She was horribly upset and she was unloading the car with groceries or whatever. And she came in and our daughter had the iPad and she tucked it in like this, like brought it to her chest, and she could see, oh, she's concealing something. And she asked to see the iPad, and our daughter wouldn't relinquish it. And then lo and behold, she was watching something that we had told her about before was inappropriate. And we learned very quickly, it's like we have to be on top of these things, because no matter how many filters we put on the iPad, for whatever reason, these things can figure out how to get through. And she's very, very intelligent little 4-year-old. She can navigate an iPad pretty well and get around things. And we noticed a change in her behavior, even like a 15-minute window where she was allowed to watch videos. Afterwards, she was more cranky. She wasn't responding as well to conversation. She wasn't looking us in the eye. Like all the things that she was doing when she was not on, it was fascinating to me that even that little bit was changing her demeanor, and she would get so lost in it that we've really had to come up with some other things that wasn't really helpful. Now you multiply that by 10 billion for a teenager and the things that the information that they're taking in all of the time. And a lot of times it's through their devices that they're connecting with their community and their friends and so on and so forth. So in relinquishing or taking away a phone, it's like taking away their lifeline. But I think at the same time, parents have to have a balance of being able to see what their kids are connecting with. I mean, like you said, it's not a one size fits all. And I think over time, kids can earn trust. But at the same time, I think parents have to be very aware and careful of, especially what's happening when you're not in a room on devices. And it's a sensitive subject, because I know that really, really hurts kids when they feel like they can't be trusted. But sometimes it's not about the trust of the kids. Sometimes it's about the trust of the world.
Yeah. And I would echo what you said of, especially for teens, those devices being like a lifeline, which I think for us that grew up without access to the internet and constant devices, that feels just wrong and dysfunctional. But that's also the reality that our kids are growing up with. And so I think even emphasizing that, like, this is their connection to their support people, to their community. Because I do think that sometimes parents maybe don't quite see it that way. And so the gravity of which, when the parent might just think I'm taking away your phone, right? Like, you don't get to watch TV anymore. Or they're kind of equating that. But for their child, that is a very serious thing. So I guess I would just encourage parents to try to understand the level of which, like, their child may be engaging in life and social interactions through their device, and even just try to have an awareness and even a respect for a healthy respect. I'm not sure if that's a good way to say it, but that it's not just something you should throw around as a punishment anytime.
I always tell parents, when you're thinking about discipline, think about the age appropriate as far as what is forever. So like with a 4-year-old, forever might be an afternoon. So if you discipline a 4-year-old and say, I'm going to take this away, keep in mind, if you go beyond forever, they're going to be demoralized. So like with a 4-year-old, you may punish them for an hour because in their mind, that's forever. I have teens that their parents will take their phone away for the remainder of the school year. And at that point, you've demoralized the kid to a point where he doesn't care anymore. And so we've got to keep in mind, like for a teen, maybe taking a phone away for a week, that's enough to get the punishment across, but you're not demoralizing them. And so it's always thinking about when you're taking something from a child, because I think that's a part of it. I think discipline's important. And I think losing privilege is part of the process. But I think a lot of times parents want to go way too far. It's like you're going to lose the right to drive for 3 months. Sometimes, depending on the kid, it's just too much, because when you get to the point where it's like, well, then it doesn't matter anymore. Then it's not a punishment anymore. You've demoralized them to the point where it's like, well, they're going to, whatever they take away, doesn't matter. And then you've created dissension. So I think it's really important that the time consequence is always age appropriate, because for a 7-year-old, maybe 2 days, that's forever. It's like always being mindful of what forever is, because when it gets to the point where it's like, well, I don't care to even get it back, it's not a punishment anymore, Right. Well, Rachel, I appreciate your time. I really appreciate our conversation and the timeliness of this, and that we are focusing on Child and Adolescent Mental Health Awareness Month. And obviously this event in Texas has just shined another light on issues that we're still dealing with as a country and as a nation. That again, I don't know that anybody has the exact answer to how to fix these, but we need to continue having these conversations, not forget about it in a day when another news story happens. I think that's been a lot of the conversation recently is, how long are we going to be thinking about Texas when the next news story comes up? And I think that's a lot of times how our cycle goes, is the next event overshadows the previous one, and we forget about that. But this is an epidemic, and is something that has been going on for a long time. And I just think that there's a lot of wounded, hurting people in this world that don't know what to do with that pain. And I think sometimes we feel that taking that out on others is going to relieve us of the pain that we're experiencing. And time and time again, I don't think that that's ever the best result. Well, I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Well, I want to thank Rachel for her time and expertise on working with such an important population and highlighting Child and Adolescent Mental Health Awareness Month. There is no question things need to change, and it breaks my heart that there are so many sad, hurt people out there that end up hurting others. If you're a parent that has noticed that your child is struggling, or even someone out there who's listening right now who is struggling with your emotional and mental health, please talk to someone, reach out and ask for help. There are resources, and Emerge Ministries, well, we're just one of them that would love to come alongside of you during this time and try to help. So I implore you to, if you're listening to this, if you need help, reach out. Just do that. Well, thank you for listening. We appreciate every listen, and we would appreciate if you would share these episodes, like them, and make a comment if you feel that this has been helpful for you. Well, until next time, or when our Savior comes, God bless.